A new year is often a time for new beginnings, new opportunities, and new resolutions. It's also a time to reflect on the past. Well, today on Our Voices, we take a look back and a look forward. What were the continent's most significant stories of the last decade? And how are the events and the people we watched and reported on likely to shape the next 10 years? Hello and welcome to Our Voices. I'm Hayde FitzPatrick. Here with me are Ayen, Bior, and in for Orion Itangishaka is Salem Solomon. Welcome back to the show, Salem.
Great to be back.
Well, it's a big and diverse continent. There were many stories, and we obviously won't be able to get to absolutely everything. But here's a look at some of the key events that we think shaped the Africa we see today. The Tunisian Revolution of 2011, perhaps a sign of what was to come in African politics. That uprising led to the ouster of President Zine El Abidine Ben Ali and the Arab Spring that gripped much of the Middle East and North Africa, followed by similar scenes in other parts of the continent. By the end of the decade, about a dozen autocrats had fallen, among them Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, in the Gambia Yahya Jammeh forced into exile. Other long-time rulers stepped down voluntarily, Angola's José Eduardo dos Santos and Joseph Kabila in the Democratic Republic of Congo. When change came to Ethiopia, the world watched as that country's new Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, began sweeping reforms. But it was Abiy's move to reopen Ethiopia's border with Eritrea after 20 years of war over land and politics that earned him a Nobel Peace Prize, as he joined the decade's list of African Nobel laureates. It was also the decade in which Africa lost South African anti-apartheid hero Nelson Mandela, former UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan, and Kenyan environmental activist Wangari Maathai. South Africa's Winnie Madikizela Mandela's death shone the spotlight on her role and legacy in the fight for justice and freedom, even as parts of South Africa burned with xenophobic violence towards other Africans, triggering retaliatory attacks on South African-owned businesses and brands in Nigeria. That West African nation also spent much of the decade trying to secure the freedom of dozens of schoolgirls kidnapped by terror group Boko Haram, as Al-Shabaab continued its reign of terror in East Africa with deadly attacks in Somalia and neighboring Kenya. African nations now look to the future on a continent that is getting younger and urbanizing faster than any other place on Earth. That's just a bit of a snapshot of the key events and trends that we saw over the last 10 years. How would you describe the last decade on the continent?
Well, for me, I would say it was a mixed bag. It was both tumultuous and hopeful. Tumultuous because we've seen a lot of natural and man-made disasters that have wreaked havoc in communities and people on the continent, but also hopeful because there's some sort of urgency for young people to go in and do grassroots movements to unseat leadership that's been there for a very long time. Autocrats that we've seen, many countries undergo through that. So that was very hopeful in the past.
I think for me the last 10 years really was revealing. It revealed who Africans are, and especially like you mentioned, young people and the effect of the power of the people. We really saw young people and women at the forefront. So I think it was revealing in that sense about who Africans truly are.
Yeah, and I think that you're both right. And that's exactly why I would say that this last decade was consequential. For example, we covered stories like the Ebola virus in West Africa in mid-decade. The Ebola virus changed our approach to pandemics. It also reinforced negative stereotypes of the continent, unfortunately, but it at the same time forced governments to reevaluate their preparedness to the virus. Obviously, it killed over 10,000 people. But I think that what happened there has also impacted how officials are handling the Ebola virus that's in the DRC right now. Of course, it's a lot more complicated because the outbreak happened in North Kivu in the DRC, in a place where there is conflict. We've seen conflict in the last year, and it's a rebel stronghold. So there is very strong mistrust of the government there. And there is good news. There is the vaccine that has been developed by scientists scientists and doctors. But, of course, there's a lot of mistrust with the vaccine itself, because this is a place where people don't trust officials because they don't trust the government. So even though you have health officials who are coming in who are trying to stop the spread of the virus, there's still a lot of mistrust.
I think it also changed people and the way we interact as in a way, especially people in the affected countries, the way they interacted. It changed things like burial practices. Ebola changed
even something as simple as shaking people's hands.
And cultures where people are used to close bodily contact, no longer. People, they said that the hand snap in many countries no longer happens because people have this mistrust and the misinformation that came along.
Misinformation was also deadlier as the virus,
right?
Because we've seen, I think, the recent story that we reported was a journalist that was really instrumental in conveying the message and helping these communities understand the virus was killed because they thought, just like health workers that were trying to solve or help communities were seen as bringing the virus into these communities. Another big story in the past year has been Ethiopian Airlines, the crash of this 302 plane in 2019, killing almost 149 passengers. It was very controversial because everybody started talking about how young the pilot was, and the blame was squarely on the pilots in the beginning, it seemed, because it had to be their fault. That wasn't the case. Now we are learning.
There was an attempt to assign blame to Ethiopian Airlines and the pilot, but I think that there's a lot of pushback within Africans who defended Ethiopian Airlines. At least that's what I saw on Twitter.
And the sad part about this was that Boeing knew all along, and because there was a crash 5 months before the Indonesian flight.
But Ethiopia in general, Ethiopia to me signified in the last 10 years that all the events seemed to me like we were barreling for once towards peace on the continent and not towards more conflict.
Think about it. I remember this is something that started in July 2018 or so. And so when the two countries made peace after 20 years, families getting together, all these emotional scenes of people hugging each other, people speaking to each other after 20 years. As a result of that, now we see Nobel Peace Prize being given to new Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed of Ethiopia. But peace hasn't entirely being realized, especially for the Eritrean people. And, the Peace Prize committee was very selective about how they phrased it. They said the effort for peace was what he was awarded for, but it hasn't been.
Beyond the effort, also the milestones, the first woman president. To me, all of those things only spelled not just for that country, but good things for the region.
Yeah, something positive, because gender parity is a serious issue across the continent, and he's making an effort.
But Salem, I can understand why you are being cautiously optimistic about the peace in Ethiopia. Just for example, in South Sudan in 2011, a long civil war ended between Sudan and Southern Sudan, and the map of Africa was redrawn when South Sudan became a new country, and there was a lot of excitement about that. But unfortunately, soon after, the country erupted into violence, and we're still covering the conflict in South Sudan right now, a conflict that has triggered famine. And so when you talk about Ethiopia and how exciting it is, of course it's exciting for a lot of people, but I think that there is cause to be cautiously optimistic moving forward.
And I must admit that I still to this day judge people who have maps of Africa that don't have South Sudan on them. But speaking of all this change, Omar al-Bashir, and I suppose not just the removal, but the death of Robert Mugabe, that really solidified the idea of this shrinking band of autocrats that we're seeing on the continent. When Robert Mugabe, not just when he was removed, but then when he passed away, I thought that was a day that many of us who grew up and who became journalists and were trained, and we were always covering Zimbabwe, a day we didn't think we'd see in his lifetime. And so when it came to Omar al-Bashir, it really made me think about what analysts are calling a new tide of people's power, what we talked about earlier, sweeping the continent, because people were really presenting their bodies on the street. They were standing up for their freedom. But I want to move on quickly to money. You have some thoughts about economic growth that we've seen over the decade.
In the past year, we saw, Africa being somewhat hopeful in terms of, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. It's a $3 trillion trade across 50 plus countries, 54 countries on the continent. It's very significant. It would change so many lives. It would make it easy to trade within each other. Because of that, that's hopeful. But in 2018, we saw Nigeria and South Africa dragged everyone down in terms of the uptick of economy that we saw, because it was only 3% of increase that we saw. But despite the heavy weights, like the two countries, other sub-Saharan African countries saw 6% to 8% growth, fastest in the world. Like countries like Ghana, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Ivory Coast, Senegal, Djibouti, showing that kind of economic growth, something to be hopeful if it continues.
It bodes well for the continent that we're not just looking at the usual suspects, Nigeria and South Africa, but that you are looking at finally seeing growth in these other countries that traditionally weren't at the forefront of economic growth. But so then it's very interesting that the Sudanese telecoms billionaire Mo Ibrahim, you'll remember he's behind the Ibrahim Index of African Governance. He talks about Africa's decade of lost opportunity, because he says all this economic growth that we have seen on the continent in the last 10 years, what is so sad about it is that it hasn't really translated into a change in economic conditions for the majority of Africans. He said we have this youthful potential workforce, and we're not tapping into that workforce, because therein lies the secret to really changing the trajectory of African nations.
And I spoke to Mo Ibrahim last year, right in the beginning of when the Sudan protests were, at the zenith of it. And he always connected these economic difficulties that young people were protesting about to governance. And he was very hopeful when I spoke to him. He said, the battle now, because he's seen transition of power in different countries that we just talked about. He said, the battle now is moving towards peaceful elections, more transparency, and he was very optimistic. He wasn't that optimistic when he was talking about Sudan in the beginning, and we have yet to see what will happen to Sudan with the new transitional leadership. But he thinks now the future is governance.
So he's saying good, but not good enough. Well, we have 10 years to try. Thank you so much, ladies. After the break, we'll take a look at the issues we think could drive the news in the year ahead as we discuss Africa in 2020. We'll be right back. Being part of Our Voices is about more than just sitting here and talking about women's issues. It's about listening to them
and bringing their opinions to the table and making sure their voices are heard.
Because our lived experiences, our stories, and our voices will help shape the next generation.
You're with Our Voices. Welcome back. Before the break, we looked at Africa's most significant moments of the decade, but it's also a new year. So what's likely to drive change on the continent in 2020? We can't predict the news, but we can bring you different perspectives. We asked fellow VOA journalists which stories they think deserve attention in 2020. Take a look.
I think the most important story in Africa in 2020 will be the influence of foreign powers. To begin, think about China, and then I'm thinking about the United States, the Europeans, the Russians, and even countries like India. In my assessment, the future of the continent of Africa in the many decades to come will probably be predicated on how they deal with this foreign influence.
The big story I'm going to be focusing on in 2020 is the increasing number of rape cases amongst women, men, and minors in the northern part of Nigeria, because every year thousands of people are being raped in Nigeria, but most of these cases happen in the northern part of Nigeria. That is why I choose this story.
Ethiopians will be going to the polls in May of 2020, pitting two different ideologies. The ideology of ethno-federalism that has been for the longest time the guiding philosophy of governance in the country, and the national identity of we see ourselves as Ethiopians first instead of seeing ourselves as these different ethnicities. And so it will be very important to watch which of those two Ethiopians are going to choose.
An important issue that I believe that will or should be covered in 2020 is the younger generation in Africa and their collaboration with the diaspora all around the world. I want to see how far they're going to take it because they're slowly moving into the entertainment industry around the world. They're moving into government issues also around the world. They're really putting their words into action. And I believe it is because of technology. It's allowing them to spread wider and wider. And I just want to see how far they're going to take it for the year.
I believe gender and youth empowerment require more attention. Youth need a platform to discuss, to have a better life, to solve their problem, to challenge whatever is happening. And also gender requires a big attention because women are still challenged due to culture, economy. So if we empower the women, if we give attention for women, then we can change the society.
Because of conflicts in so many different countries in Africa, journalists and leaders around the world should really focus on the refugee issues, trying to understand the situation and how to come up with solutions to actually decrease the number of refugees across the globe.
Perhaps the most important story in Africa will be taking place in Somalia. The country will be electing MPs, and for the first time we are hoping that the Electoral Commission will pass a bill, constitution will be reviewed, and then the people will be voting for MPs and the MPs will elect a president. It will be the first time that ordinary people participate in popular elections in Somalia for 50 years.
I think it's going to be terrorism in the Sahel region simply because we don't understand much of what's going on. We have news of correspondents sending stories from time to time. We don't really understand why is this happening, why hundreds of people are being killed. So I think it's an important story also because the sentiment of anger is growing in the region against the leaders and against friends.
This year we would like to focus on a story which is related to the impact of the fighting in northern Mozambique, particularly the impact on women and how women are surviving and trying to make ends meet for their families.
So as you see in that package, Vincent talks about, how Africa has become a playground basically for foreign powers. China's been investing a lot of money with infrastructural developments. We've seen the railway investment, so much investment on the continent, but also, political games that we're seeing between superpowers as well. Military investments in East Africa because of the strategic location. Russia is making a comeback after the Cold War. We've seen proxy wars in that way because different interests are playing out.
And Russia has all these connections that they have had. Speak of proxy wars, it really takes us back to the Cold War era. We've seen this movie before, right?
And also because Russia's also very interesting because they're using technology. For instance, countries have elections. They use Facebook accounts for disinformation campaigns. Tech giant Facebook had to take down Facebook accounts that were targeting places where there are elections to influence, public view, to undermine or, prop up, political actors on the continent who they favor. So it's very interesting to see different powers, foreign powers at play.
What's also going to be important going into the next decade, all these countries that we mentioned earlier who are in the midst of new dispensations. And I hope the world will be patient as these countries learn now to go from, just having a democracy, but to also managing their democracies.
As you're both talking, I can't help but think that I think the biggest story in the next couple of years will be the weather. And we've seen how the weather has impacted tens of thousands of people across the world, really. Whether it's wildfires in Australia, a flood in Kenya, a cyclone in Mozambique, it's the impact of climate change, I think, will continue to be a very big issue. And I think that people will begin to ask, who should we hold accountable? Should it be our governments? Should it be corporations with high carbon footprints? Who should be held accountable if a cyclone hits Mozambique, or if there's a drought in South Sudan and farmers can't farm and feed their own children?
Gone are the days when we can say the weather should not be on the political agenda anymore. It definitely should be. climate change should be part of every country's political agenda as well.
Right, because there are things that governments can do to prepare their citizens for a drought or for floods.
When you think about climate change as well, it adds a layer because at the heart of everything is lack of resources, and people are displaced because of lack of resources, basic resources, lack of drinking water, clean drinking water, lack of food and things like that. And so you add a layer of that, and you have natural disasters that displace people, don't have shelters, don't have anywhere else to go, and that is all interlinked in that way.
Yeah, and like we said, also, gone are the days when it's not on the agenda, but also gone are the days when you say, let's talk about the weather, you actually mean you're going to talk about the most boring thing. Yeah. No, it is now a very, very pressing issue, and when we say let's talk about the weather, it's a serious conversation we need to start taking more seriously inside our nations. Also, we want to hear from you. What do you think are going to be the stories that will drive the news in 2020? You can find us on social media. Our handle there is @VOA Our Voices. You can also catch us on WhatsApp. That number is there on your screen. Tell us if we missed anything. Tell us what you'd like to see us focus on in the new year.
After the break in our Women to Watch segment, 3 women will be watching in 2020. Stay with us.
Being part of Our Voices is about more than just sitting here and talking about women's issues. It's about listening to them
and bringing their opinions to the table and making sure their voices are heard.
Because our lived experiences, our stories, and our voices will help shape the next generation. Welcome back. Over the past year, we brought you the stories of African women who are making their mark in the world of politics, science, technology, sports, and the arts. And as we enter a new year, we'd like to share with you 3 women we think could make an impact in 2020 in our Women to Watch segment. So, ladies, when we say that these are women to watch, we are not endorsing them, and we're not agreeing with their platform. What we are saying is that they are in a position to influence a lot of people, and we will watch how their influence impacts those people. And I think that one of those women to watch is Vera Daves de Sousa of Angola. She is the first female finance minister, and she is a reformist. Of course, as you know, Angola is a very oil-rich country. About 90% of their revenue comes from crude oil exports, and that does not sit well with Vera. Vera wants to diversify the economy, and one of the ways that she wants to do that is to eliminate subsidies. The IMF says that that is not a good idea, but she has said that she is going to do it, and we will see how that decision will impact Angola and, others as well.
What a change for Angola, especially, after what the country's been going through and the leadership change it's had. Allegations of corruption, nepotism, favoritism, because of the resources that they have.
Yeah, she has her work cut out for her.
Isn't that the truth? And another woman we're watching is Froeni Mebratu. She was named the 2019 CNN Hero of the Year. She was awarded for her dedication to keep girls in school by designing a reusable menstrual pad and trying to end cultural stigma around the issue. This woman is something.
I'm watching her too. Quietly, I'm watching her too.
And think about the impact she's making in young girls' lives. Basically, they can go to school because they're on their periods. This is bizarre that these communities think that this is something to hide. And we're not talking about just like the communities within her circle. We're talking about 30 million girls and women of reproductive age in Ethiopia only that don't have access to affordable pads, and she's making it possible for them. She just won $100,000 because of the award. So she came and sat down with us and talked to us about how to break the taboo. Here's what she had to say.
The cultural stigma
is not just around women. We also have to include boys. Otherwise, how else are we going to have a society transform in this issue? So by doing that, you can see from the eyes of the boys that, wow, yes, if that is what it is, this is what it means to have a period. When you include the boys, that's when you transform the society. And it's making a tremendous, tremendous difference in this issue of bringing dignity to all.
You know, this is so true, what she talks about. I believe in it too, that you have to educate boys. When you teach about women's rights, men need to understand and be taught that as well. Same thing, when it comes to menstruation, it's not just an issue that should be something girls need to worry about. We have to get men and boys thinking about it too.
I mean, someone once told me a period should end a sentence, not a girl's education.
Right, and it shouldn't be a sentence for a young girl.
And girls in the communities she was serving would dig a hole and squat over. And that's how it was considered as a shame, you know? And even when we have quote unquote accidents, that it's not a bodily, natural thing, that in itself is something that she's fighting against.
Speaking of someone who's young and beautiful and just amazing and has caught my attention over and over again is Zozibini Tunzi, the new Miss Universe. I mean, who can stop talking about this woman? Beauty pageants aside, I admire how she's using this platform. And she talks about never having the right skin color or never having the right hair in a country like South Africa, where people of color were not even deemed human. And so the importance of seeing her on a global stage and speaking from the heart and from experience is so important. Ayen, I know you always talk about the importance of representation.
Yeah, I think she certainly does. And I remember watching her and just remembering me as a young girl and wishing that I had someone like her to look up to. She's very confident in her own skin. Now, to be honest with you, even me right now as a young adult, I don't have that confidence. So it's been really nice to see her really take the stage and take command of her presence and just let people know that she does deserve to be here. It sends a message, I think, to a lot of us.
And it's just not beauty, it's also brains. She knows what to say. When it comes to what are you advocating for, she says education, she says gender-based violence, and these things that have impact on so many young women in South Africa with the femicide and all kinds of gender-based violence that the country's been going through. Anybody could relate to what her message is beyond just wearing her natural hair and skin and being proud of
and that the whole
who
package
she is.
Beautiful. Thank you so very much, ladies. This has been really great, very insightful. I look forward to working with you. We have our work cut out for us this year. Salem, thank you so much for always coming when we call.
Always great to be here.
What a great way to start this new year. Now, of course, this was also the decade in which we launched the show, Our Voices. And we hope that in the coming weeks, months, and years, you will continue to join us here at the table. Of course, we want to bring you the stories and talk about the things that you really care about. So don't be shy. Go to our social media channels. Tell us what you want to see and what you want to hear on the show. And that is where we will leave it. Thank you for always watching. If we don't see you somewhere on the continent, you can always find us here on Our Voices. It's been a great journey so far. Here are some of our favorite moments. Take good care in 2020.
We are here at Kalerwe Market in Uganda, Kampala, where in this whole market, women are crying out for their situations to change. Situations of sexual harassment, sanitary situations, situations of childcare.
Now, if this school never existed, I'm wondering where we could take these girls, especially the girls who are being subjected to the harmful cultural practices like child marriage, human trafficking.
Africans were enslaved in this country for more than 200 years. Many call it America's original sin. And today there is heated debate about reparations for the descendants of millions of Africans enslaved in this country.
Men and women of African descent actually lived in this community and were buried here, and it gives me a direct connectivity to the history of my own community.
Our kids are raped every single day.
I think the that women have always showed up because they have the most to lose. And Sudan is a really good example of that. They have public order laws that are extremely restrictive towards women. So what we saw during these protests is women showing up to say that we are going to correct the laws of the past to make sure that our human rights are protected.
They went out to demand freedom, change, justice, and peace. It's not necessary anymore to climb on a car. I can be in any place to cheer with the people.